15, so I think going. Some of you, I'm Wendy Brand. I'm fairly new to this committee. I'm sure some of you have seen me around, but did not know my name. So anyway, I invited Marcel here today, and Marcel Wuethrich is a UW-Madison distinguished scientist in the field of immunology, researching areas that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. If he wants to go into that more, he can. But the reason I invited him here today is he's also interested in habitat conservation. He was a member of Mayor Soglin's pollinator task force and helped develop the demonstration garden at the end of the Odana Golf Course parking lot, which is where I happen to live. And I saw him give a little talk, and I thought it would be good for our group here. And so he's with us here to tell us that story. So I will hand it over to you, Marcel.
Well, I hear a little bit of echoing, so if people could turn off their microphones, that probably would help with that. Well, thank you for the introduction and the invitation to give a talk. I'm excited to give this. I put this together new, and so I haven't given it before, so that's exciting to me. So as you said, I'm a biologist by education. I studied microbiology at the University of Bern, and now I'm a scientist at the UW-Madison. I'm also a biologist by heart. Since my early childhood, I'm interested in watching wildlife and birds. And in watching birds, I quickly realized that birds thrive if they have a habitat that provides them food, shelter, and places to nest. And to give you a take-home message, or the punchline of the talk is the following. Healthy food networks for birds and other wildlife, including us, they start with native plant communities. Those will feed insects, which will then in return help foster the propagation of the plants. Without plant and insects, there will be no herbivores, no carnivores, there will be no higher food network, and there will also be no humans. It's as simple and easy to understand as that. The key in this paradigm is that the plant communities need to be native to the location. If you have plant communities that come from a different area of the planet, insects will not be able to eat those plants. And so the food network will break apart. So this brings me to the title of my talk, How to Save the Pollinators and Basically Ourselves. So I'm going to talk about what pollinators are, what's happening currently with our pollinators and why we need them, and how can we save them and basically us from extinction. And I'll give examples of native yards and prairie restorations in our neighborhood. So these species are all capable of pollinating plants and basically foster their propagation. So these include birds like hummingbirds, butterflies, bees, wasps, flies, moths, beetles, lacewings, bats, and many others. This is a study that came out in 2016. The numbers change a little bit from one study to the other, but you can see that honeybees and native bees, which are probably even more important for pollination, they all decline. That includes bumblebees, butterflies. For monarch butterflies, we hear numbers between 80 to 97% declines in overwintering populations. Native beetles get displaced by non-native species. Other bees and leafcutter bees and mason bees decline. So the bottom line is they're declining to a great extent. So you might think, what's the big deal losing the insects? having less insects probably means less smudges on my car windshield when I drive to the countryside. Well, unfortunately, insects fulfill many functions, as I initially explained. Those are illustrated in this diagram. And as I said at the very beginning, they are part of the bottom of the food chain. They pollinate the plants, and the plants feed them. If you take away plant communities and the insects, you will have no herbivores and predators, and basically you will have no humans either. This message, has been delivered by many in the field. Edward Wilson is a famous entomologist professor who recently passed away. He's known as the Ant-Man, and he states it clearly. A world without insects, there will be no lions, no tigers, no bears, no birds, no bats, no bunnies, and no humans. So with that in mind, I can show you some clear examples in our daily life that will be impacted by the loss of pollinators. These images have been put together by the Success Society and Whole Foods, and it basically illustrates the grocery aisle for the dairy choices, above with bees and below without bees. And when you look at the vegetable or food section, a similar picture shows there will be a lot of groceries that will not be available anymore. And it could maybe even be worse. So what are the reasons that our pollinators decline? As I mentioned before, they need food. They need different foods at different stages of their lives. So in the larvae or caterpillar form, they need plants to eat on so they can grow. And I'd like to give you an example between a native plant species versus an exotic and non-native species. This bur oak supports over 500 different species of caterpillars. They can all eat oak leaves and will be able to grow and sustain the food chain. Whereas introduced ginkgo biloba leaves will only support 2 or 3 species of caterpillars. There's nothing wrong with ginkgo biloba in its native environment, but here in North America, it's just out of place and has not co-evolved with the insects. So therefore, there is no ecological benefit of introducing these species in our environment. It basically takes away space that could be taken by a native species that would benefit insects and the food network. Other threats are loss of habitats. Those could include dry stems where these insects could lay their eggs and could overwinter. They need certain cavities. Another big threat currently is the use of pesticides, in particular the neonicotinoids that will broadly kill insect populations, and not just the targeted populations, typically other populations that are not intentionally targeted. But the good news is that each of us can make a change by making certain changes in the landscape. And if you have done so, you could teach others why it's important to do that, and basically create a pollinator-friendly environment. Doug Tallamy is an entomology professor at the University of Delaware, and he has realized the importance of insect pollinators as well. And like I said, his numbers are that 80% of all the plants and 90% of all the flowering plants would disappear, and so would be the food webs that are supported by the insects, including reptiles, amphibians, birds, and fishes, and so on. His approach to the problem the crisis we face these days is the homegrown national park. He's giving many talks and has published many books about the subject. And I'll be talking more about his ideas. He is proposing that we would develop a different land ethic and incorporate nature where we live. Living with nature is our only option that is left to us if we wanted to survive. And we need to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscape. A landscape like this is basically not sustainable for pollinator populations and basically not sustainable for a thriving food network. So where shall we begin? Doug Tallamy, I'm basically reiterating what Doug Tallamy is proposing in his talks and his books, and I think those are valuable ideas. We currently have about 15% of our landscape in conserved public areas like national parks, but this is not enough in order to sustain insect populations and pollinator populations, because these areas are too fragmented and too small to be able to sustain insect populations. So we have to think beyond and use the rest, the 85% of the other land that is mostly private but also public, and try to conserve habitat or fostering habitat that could benefit the pollinators. So he's proposing to look at power and pipeline right-of-ways, golf courses, airports, rural residential suburbia, exurbia, urban centers, roadside and railroad right-of-ways. And if you tally up the surface area of all these places, it will be close to 600 million acres. And that's bigger than the states here combined. So it will have a huge impact on not only the pollinator and insect populations, but basically our sustainability of our food networks. Well, someone might say these are a project of large scale, but arguments can be made that even small places and places where you would not expect to be able to restore can be restored. Here's an example of, that's the pipeline in Manhattan, New York. Someone used careful, thoughtful planting of native plants in this area. So down here, you see a butterfly milkweed, and lo and behold, even in this urban center, there were monarchs visiting the flowers and leafcutter bees pollinating those plants. So the message is, if you plant the native plants, the pollinators will follow. Here's another example. Pam Carlson lives in Chicago. Her lot is 1/10 of an acre, which is about 3 times smaller than the average US lot. She's about half a block away from Chicago's Kennedy's Expressway. It is directly adjacent to one of the O'Hare's airport runways. There's no connectivity with preserved land. And Pam introduced 60 native plant species and a water feature in her yard. She counted over 100 species of birds that used her yard, including a woodcock, for those of you who know what a woodcock is. The point is, it doesn't matter how small your property is, pollinators and others will find the restored land. I'd like to give you a few examples of plant-insect relationships. Plants and insects co-evolved over centuries, and if you plant the plant, the insect will follow. So here's an example of these are called ditch daisies or Biden's aristosa, and it attracts the goldenrod stowaways. Another example is the hackberry emperor. This particular butterfly, or the caterpillar of it, eats hackberry. So if you plant hackberry in your yard, you will likely get caterpillars that feed on the leaves of those trees. If you introduce goldenrods, you will get species like the Arcigara flower moth, the goldenrod flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, or brown hooded owlets, and other caterpillars. With goldenrods, you will likely also get the goldenrod gallfly, which lays eggs into the stems of the goldenrods, which then swell and produce those galls. And inside, the larvae will grow. And birds, they know from experience that there is a juicy insect inside. And so the downy woodpecker and the chickadee will open most of these galls during the winter months, and it provides important winter food that they would otherwise not have and may not survive the winter because of it. So if we wanted to foster habitat for pollinators, I think we should shrink the sizes of our lawns and get rid of the dead scape that basically has no ecological function or benefit. In fact, it pollutes water, soil, and air. And oftentimes it drives your neighbor crazy, who would like to eat dinner outside when the weather finally warms up. So we have about 40 million of acres of lawn in this country. If we were able to convert just half of it to native landscapes, that would be 20 million of acres. And that would be larger than the following national parks combined: the Adirondacks, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands, Olympic, Sequoia, Grand Canyon, Denali, and Great Smoky Mountain, all combined, will have more converted area, a huge impact for fostering pollinators. The benefits would be that we would create a personal relationship with nature by creating these areas and tending to them. There would be free access to that area. We could avoid crowds. We don't have to travel to crowded national park areas. And it's manageable and doable because it's at smaller size for every one of us. And most importantly, everyone would be empowered to change and fix dead landscapes. One of the satisfaction that I have when I convert a dead landscape like this is to see the change. Not only to see the change, but then see how the insects will follow. That's one of the most gratifying aspects of restoration work, I think. Well, what happens in Madison or in our neighborhoods? In 2014 and 2015, President Obama realized that pollinators are in big decline, and he encouraged communities to look what can we do to halt the decline. And so Mayor Soglin at that time initiated the Pollinator Protection Task Force, and I was involved in some of their meetings. And the task force put forth a report. And in that report, they had certain recommendations as to what the city or the community could do in order to foster pollinator habitat. So one of them was to stop using pesticides like the neonics, restore habitats, change mowing practices, maybe along bike trails, to allow flowers to be able to bloom and then provide nectars to the pollinators. There's a lot of building-related landscaping that could be changed into a more ecologically valuable scaping. And they also proposed opportunities for so-called demonstration projects or areas, and to foster public communication and education. So I looked around in our neighborhood, and I'm not trying to point fingers here, but I can see plenty of yards that are, these dead landscapes with no ecological value. The trees and shrubs that are planted here are likely not native. So there is a huge potential for pollinator habitat and also public education. I'd like to give you an example by showing you how I converted my yard into a natural landscape. So I basically converted the whole front yard. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. Not sure if I have control about the cursor, but the front yard here is
Yeah, I can see it.
You can see it. It's converted into native flowers, including the terrace. I have rain gardens in all four corners of the house. The bushes and trees that surround the perimeter of the property, I converted completely into native trees and shrubs because of the benefits. And I also helped my neighbor do the same. So I'm gonna close in so you can see more closely how it looks on a close-up. So this is the front yard. This is in July. One thing to note is that if you have a large variety of different species, the appearance of your yard changes greatly over the course of the growing season. So in July, it's the peak of the blooming time. And so you have lots of flowers blooming, but there's some that are blooming very early in the season, like spring ephemerals, and then some that bloom late in fall, right before it freezes over. But this is an example of how a native yard would look like. It wasn't always like this. So when I bought the house in 2010, it was a traditional landscape with lawn and hostas here and evergreens that provide little to nothing to pollinators. The backyard is the same, non-native bushes, evergreens, and I got rid of all of them. The first thing I did is I installed rain gardens in all four corners of the house because I live on a hill, and they're in a heavy downpour. We get water from the south side of the property. And so by installing rain gardens, I could basically capture the rainwater, not only for my roof, but also from my neighbor's roof. And with trenches, I could capture any water that would be running down the hill. This is how the installation of rain garden looks like. I basically take the downspout and I bring it with a trench to an area that I dug out a little bit and then put in native plants. This is how it looks right after planting. Here is the trench that's basically lined with plastic and pebbles, so you don't see the plastic. Looks like a natural riverbed. And here starts the rain garden area with the native plants. These are now native bushes. So it looked like that right after installation. And a year later, the plants have grown up to their mature size, and they start fulfilling functions for the pollinators. I did the same in the front yard. I took the water from this downspout, led it to that rain garden. This is on the north west side of the property, and this is on the south east side of the property. But I still had traditional landscaping with lawn that doesn't do much for the pollinators. So the next year, I got a lot of different species of seeds, and I also put plucks for plants, so small plants that you can buy at from sources that generate native plants. So you can see I have over 60 species of native flowers that I try to get to grow here. This is how it looked in 2013, a year later, after a few hours of weeding. You can see the native plants are taking off. Then the following year was time to remove the remaining part of the lawn in the front yard. And I also took out the terrace, the area between the road and the sidewalk, which I am obligated to mow, but I'd rather have native flowers and weed there than mowing the lawn on a weekly basis. I put in species that stay short because there's certain regulations from the city that plants should not be over a certain height. So I paid attention to that and chose species that stay shorter. It also creates a natural staging effect. The same year, when I put the plants, some of them already flowered, like the butterfly milkweed here and others. The next spring, this is how it looked on the terrace. Lots of flowering plants. And like I said before, the flower composition and the bloom times of the different species changes over the course of the growing season. So it's a constantly changing, very dynamic landscape. These are some species highlighted, like Penstemon grandiflorus and Harebell on the right. So it can be very attractive. Butterfly milkweed.
You got butterfly milkweed.
And it is a very dynamic process. So I'm in there to take care of more competitive species so that I don't lose diversity because very competitive species will outshade the less competitive species, and over time you might only have a few more dominant species that will survive, and you basically lose diversity. And you want diversity because the more different plant species you have, the more different species of insects you will be able to attract and provide food for. So this is how it looked in June last year. And oops. And in July, it changed. It looked like this. And this is the whole point why you plant native species, because the pollinators and their larvae will come and will find this area. This is a caterpillar of a monarch butterfly. On the left, you see a milkweed beetle. On the left here, this is a very short plant. It's called pussytoe. There are two antennaria species that we have in this part of the country. And if you plant pussytoes, you're almost guaranteed to get the caterpillars of the American painted ladies. It's a orange-brown butterfly that flies in from the south every year because it cannot survive our cold winters. But it will lay its eggs on the pussytoes. It will not completely defoliate the plant, but just enough to be able to grow a caterpillar. So this is just an example of a plant caterpillar interaction. If you don't have pussytoes, you won't have that butterfly. It's as simple as that. Other insects like this black wasp, I forgot the name of it, but it's a relatively large wasp. It can be predatory, I think, with other insects, but when it visits the flowers, it does no harm at all. It doesn't sting, it looks menacing, but it's very interested in visiting the dotted mint, Monarda punctata, every year. Bumblebees, of course, here visiting partridge pea. Lavender hyssop on the left. This is probably pale purple coneflower on the right, attracting bumblebees. Liatris species on the left, yellow coneflower on the right, great blue lobelia on the left, probably a dwarf blazing star on the right, blue vervain. This can be a tall plant up to 5-6 feet tall. Joe pieweed, very good pollinator plant. And the absolute magnet for the monarch butterflies is meadow blazing star, Liatris ligulus stylus. If you plant that plant, they will flock. They will come in large numbers. And if you just have a few plants, they will go after those plants. With plants and insects, and in this case, seeds, you will also attract birds. Like American goldfinches love the immature seeds from hyssop. And they, in my yard, they will be so close to the window and they will sing full blast their song. And when you sit in the house, you almost have the impression that the bird is singing inside the house. So you get a chance to see the birds eating their native food, and evidence for the food network being in action and functioning. This is a young catbird, and we have catbirds every year, usually 1 or 2 broods. It takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to feed 1 brood of chickadees. So if you don't have a landscape that grows caterpillars, you will simply not have young birds like this catbird or chickadees. And most bird species, they will predominantly eat caterpillars or feed their brood caterpillars because they're so nutritious. For the young birds, they will not eat seeds at a young age. Here's another example of a friend of us, Colleen Sims. She lives in the Westmoreland neighborhood. You may know this property, or certainly this street. She lives at 3902 at St. Clair. And she bought the property, I think, in around 2018 or 19. And this is how it looked before she started restoring it. Typical lawn desert in front of the house. She hired us, by us, I mean my wife Heather and I, and our first job was to remove the sod. So we rented this sod cutter from Home Depot, and we pushed it along the property. And it was very hard work, but I think it paid off after a few hours of pushing that thing. We had a clean slate that is now ready for planting. Colleen had these pavers that she puts along the edge, just to get a little bit more distance from the sidewalk to the yard. And then we planted. Colleen purchased around 600 plugs from various sources of native plant species, and so we planted them directly into the soil. We didn't amend the soil because native plants, they don't require super rich soil. They can pretty much grow in any soil. It could be almost gravel or sand, and they still grow. After planting a few weeks later, it looked like this. We fenced the property. It's especially important when you're the first one in your neighborhood who plants native plants. The rabbits like to mow your native plants down. So it's good to fence them the first few years, just to give them a heads up and some space some time to grow. And the next year, Colleen was pleased to see what she saw in her front yard. Here's a little fun fact. Look at the reflection in her sunglasses. It shows her front yard. So here's another example. a project that I'm involved in at the parking lot of the Odana Hills Golf Course. As part of the Pollinator Protection Task Force, I mentioned that demonstration areas were proposed. And I'm riding my bike to go to campus every day on this connector path to the bike path. And I thought to myself, this would be a really nice area for such a demonstration area. It was basically a non-mowed area for many years. It had its problems with non-native invasive species. So the first thing we did in 2016, we did a controlled burn. Jack and Bonnie McLaughlin typically lead the burn. They have the burn equipment. So we did a first burn and then just looked what would appear in the first growing season. But we also put a lot of seeds down that we got from various sources, from Ron Andrus, from the prairie enthusiasts who collects a lot of seeds in Dane County parks. We collected a lot of seeds from our own yard, and the Midwell Heights Neighborhood Association donated plugs to put into the ground in the spring. And the following year, this is how it looked. So we had basically, there were 4 species of milkweeds already present at that site, but not much else in terms of native flowers. The 4 species of milkweeds included butterfly milkweed, like shown here in the foreground, like here, then common milkweeds. And so I basically mowed around the milkweeds to keep the grass short so that the seeds could germinate. They need light for germination. But I wanted to preserve the milkweeds because they have an important function for the monarch butterflies. This is rose or swamp milkweed, and the 4th species is a rural milkweed. This is a more delicate, short milkweed species, but all of them support the monarch butterflies. It's their only natural food that the caterpillars will eat on. On the left here, by the way, you see a male. Those black dots on the wings give it away that it's a male. We were a bit impatient. The seeds that we broadcasted the year before, not many of those germinated, and so we thought that we probably have to eliminate the thick mat of turf grass that was there for years in order to allow the seeds to reach their ground when we broadcast them. So during the growing season of 2017, we herbicide carefully the plot by not killing the milkweeds. And then in the fall, we had a lot of dead thatch and we burned that off. So Steve Dahlgren took these drone images of the controlled burn, and it actually opened the ground quite well. So then we heavily seeded in late fall in 2017 with a nice complexity of seed mixes from different sources, like Ron Andrus again, Madison Audubon at Goose Pond provided seeds. Maddie Dumas helped us collect these. And we also put in plugs from Aglicol, again, supported by the Neighborhood Association, which is a great supporter for this project. The next spring in 2018, this is how it looked. So we still have the milkweeds that were there before, so we didn't kill them off. And now we have pioneer species like the Sweet William catchfly, shown here in a close-up, but still a lot of weeds. The Neighborhood Association asked me whether I would be willing to give a tour of the prairie and talk about the restoration, so I did. And it attracted a nice group of people from the neighborhood. So was a little bit of a show and tell. We could see that there's a few species that took from the initial seeding, like these black-eyed Susans, and but not a lot of diversity at this point. Nevertheless, we saw species like the praying mantises and the black eastern swallowtail. Then the following growing season in summer 2019, we saw a lot of native plants coming up, but with it, a lot of non-native aggressive species, including fleabane and Queen Anne's lace and wild parsnip on the right. So people from city engineering, led by Maddie Dumas, and Operation Fresh Start helped us weed some of the heavily infested areas. And these are, we generated many of these piles that were then taken away by the city. The usual suspects are burdock, curly dock, thistles, Queen Anne's lace, daisies, wild parsnips, and many others. And here you can see before and after weeding. So you can see a lot of the white flowers here are non-native species that were eliminated here on the right after weeding. The next year in fall, it looked a lot more diverse than it ever had before. And we did another prairie tour this year in July, and my father-in-law, Joe Inzalaco, was kind enough to took this short video. It takes about a minute or 42 seconds, and you can see an overview here of the restored area. In the middle, we have this mowed path so people can walk through it. I see a lot of mothers with their toddlers and babies walking through it, and they go there to see the butterflies, and that's exactly what it's intended to do, to experience the public to see native flower habitats. Of course, the flower composition and the color composition changes greatly over the course of the year. Right now, there's bergamot, the purple flower dominating, and you can see it attracts the monarch butterflies. So it does its job, but there's many more butterfly species, and now there's also there's native bird species breeding, including song sparrows. We have mallards breeding in there and actually hatching chicks. So I'm at the end of the talk. I'd like to give many thanks to City Parks, who is the owner of the project and allowed us to establish this demonstration area. The Neighborhood Association provided many donations for either plants or equipment. Middleton Firefighters 311 donated funds for plants. There's many volunteers that helped with the installation and weeding. I wasn't able to list everybody here. And then, of course, the burn crew with Bonnie McMullen and Jack Lawton. And Jack usually helps with spraying very invasive species like crown wedge and Canada thistle that are hard to just weed. Rose and Steve Dahlgreen helped a lot with providing the lawnmower initially. And Steve was taking some pictures that I used for this talk. And the Odana Golf Course also helps fencing off the prairie. If you have any questions or want to contact me about any potential projects that you have in mind, you could email me or text me at the number that I provided. I also listed sources for native plants here. I can probably not go through each one of those sources, but if you email or text me, I can send you a list of these sources. They all have native species. It's important, like I tried to emphasize, it's important that you get native species and not a species, not a cultivar or a species that is not native to the area, because it simply has no benefit to the pollinators. So with that, I'm at the end of my talk, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Marcel,
Yeah.
could you talk about different methods of preparing the soil? You talked about rending the turf breaker or whatever. Are there other methods of preparing a yard that currently has turf so that it's ready for prairie?
Yeah, there's more than one method. Of course, eliminating the sod is very instant, and you could plant right away. You could use herbicides, you could kill it off. You could smother it with plastic. If you do that during the warm summer months, the grass will be dead, pretty soon, and then you could plant. So there's more than one strategy. You basically want to open up the soil. However, I've learned over the course of a few years that the prairie enthusiasts, they oftentimes interseed. It takes much longer when you interseed native species. It can take up to 7 to 10 years for those plants to germinate, but eventually, my understanding is that you might achieve a greater diversity than when you nuke the place and seed it all from the start. It's much faster that way. You have more instant results and gratification, but over the long haul, it might actually pay out to be patient. We were simply not patient enough at the Odana Prairie to see that happening, and I was doubtful about it. But I've learned that it's actually an important approach to consider as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey, Marcel, this is Emily. There's about 12 of us in the room here at church, so thank you very much for the presentation. I'm curious if you or any of the pollinator task force folks were involved in the Glenway redesign that took place last summer. That's hopefully we'll get to see the beginnings of this summer, because I know they used a lot of native plants in that project as well.
Yeah, I wasn't personally involved, but I know that there are people that are active in the neighborhood, like Cy Wittstrand was heavily involved, and supported the project with advice. And there were some people from the neighborhood were involved in helping plant those native species. But I was personally not that much involved because I'm busy with my own restoration project. So when it comes to the growing season, I'm usually busy with my own yard and the prairie restoration, and I have little time to spend on other projects. But it is a very important project, and it will be very interesting to see how it will develop and how the community will use the space to explore.
Yeah, feel free to chime in with other questions or put them in the chat. We're monitoring that.
Sure.
I guess one thing I will say with the church, we do have plans in the front in that grass area. We're putting in a vegetable herb garden in there. You'll see there's a patch of dirt dug up if you go by. And in a few weeks, hopefully the person leading that project is going to give a presentation. So I can let you know the date on that if you want to, and you can come in on the Zoom.
There is actually, I've attended a talk at the Alliant Energy Center by Neil DeBall, who is the founder of Prairie Nursery. And I remember him saying that if you have problems with vegetables, in particular, let's say for example, tomatoes, it helps to have native plants either interplanted with the vegetables or in the surrounding area, because the native plants will bring in the predators for the pests. So if you have problems with tomatoes, he said, plant rattlesnake master. It's a native species of plants, and your problems with the tomatoes will go away. So the message is, the more diverse your environment is, the more predators of your pest or problem species will go away. So those two things would actually complement each other nicely.
Marcel, I have a question. Are
Sure.
there any laws in Madison that you're aware of that would prevent people from planting prairie in their like their front or backyards? Have you ever had any problems with getting a citation for weeds or something like that?
No, I think in the city of Madison, it's allowed to have native yards. There's certain restrictions in terms of heights, like on the terrace, I think the first 1 or 2 feet from the curb should not be taller than 8 inches. It's handled a little bit flexible, as long as there is not anybody who complains. Like when you go through certain neighborhoods, the plant heights is larger than 8 inches. And so it really depends a little bit on the community and how tolerant they are.
Mm-hmm.
But for a while, you actually needed a permit, but I think it should be the other way around.
Yeah.
You should
need a
be
permit for lawn.
exactly. You should have to pay for a permit in order to establish lawn, because you're actually polluting, and you're not doing a service to the environment and us as a society. So things like native yards should be encouraged with incentives. And there are some incentive for native yards. Like, for example, if you can demonstrate that you can convert your impermeable area, your roof, into permeable area by feeding the water into rain gardens, you can actually get a lower rate on the wastewater. And I've done that. You'd have to provide evidence for that. So the city of Madison gives incentives for having rain gardens, at least. But I think our community should go even further and make a stronger point in supporting and maybe discouraging, ecologically non-beneficial yardscaping.
Great,
So
thank
yeah,
you.
we do have a comment in the chat. Don Thornton says, I live directly on Midvale, and Marcel helped me get started over 6 years ago, and I've never had a complaint.
Well, that's good to know.
And I do encourage, if you haven't walked through the garden at the golf course, I really encourage you to do it. Our property sort of backs right up to the end of the parking lot there. And so it's kind of in my extended backyard, which is, we reap the benefits of it. But there's a nice mowed path that goes through it, and it's beautiful. Okay, we got a question here in the room from Carolyn.
Are there some good handout materials that we could have at church or other places that would kind of foster this idea and give a few places where people could go to see and things like that?
Handouts. Well, I guess one way to start would be I could send you the list of sources for native plants and trees, and typically, at least you see the plant lists, what they have. The city of Madison also organizes the so-called Planting Cost Share program, and as part of that, I attended a course that teaches you how to install rain gardens. So that might be a place to start, and so you get information that way. But these days you just go online and you get information on any subject you basically want. So if you're interested in converting your lawn into native landscaping, there's tons of information out there. But I'd be happy to provide any consultation at any time and share my experiences. There's a lot of things that I learned throughout the years. Like I don't do restorations the same way like I did 10 years ago, because I've learned a few things over the years. So yeah, I think there's a lot of information out there.
You have another question in the room?
Yeah, I've noticed on the south end of the church here that there's a big black tarp in the grass. And I wondered if somebody's planning to plant something there, what's going on there. I've noticed it.
I don't know too much about it, but Jeff Wild is putting in a garden there. And I think in a few weeks, we're trying to get him lined up to give a talk during this time for that. So watch for that.
Yeah, that could be one of the strategies that I mentioned. Basically, darkening out the area and have things die underneath. But will still be there. There will be a seed bank, and so when you remove the tarp, you could still get weeds. So you just have to be prepared to take care of that.
Marcel, could you comment a little bit on sort of winter care for your pollinator garden? What do you do and what do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean there's more than one way of doing it. You know, for a long time I cut down my native plants in the fall because, you know, I thought, oh, it looks a little bit more ordinary, that, you know, people might like it better in the neighborhood. But for the last few years, I haven't done that, mostly because I think it's important to have the plants stand in the wintertime. You know, there's some insects that overwinter in the stems, and if the stems are on the ground, it's not the same as if they're standing up. When they're standing up, they're mostly dry. And so, you know, the larvae or the insect might survive under those conditions, but if it's buried in wet snow and rain, you know, it could just get moldy and die. So, and plus, I think it provides interesting structure in our yards, even during the winter months. So what we do for the prairie, we try to do regular controlled burns, mostly to remove dead thatch and opening up the ground to more light. By doing so, we often encourage more rigorous bloom of, you know, the plants, the perennials that live there. We don't really harm the plants because they're dormant during that time, and native forbs and grasses, they're used to have, you know, burns that are either initiated by lightning, or, you know, for a long time Native Americans have light up fire just to preserve grassland for the bisons. So that's a process that or tool that is often used to repress forestation of our prairies. And actually, I started doing a controlled burn in my front yard last spring. Bonnie and Jack McMullen Lawton, they do that for their yards for a long time, and so they helped me do the first controlled burn. What you need is a permit from the city fire department, and it costs a little fee, but it's a natural way to get rid of the dead thatch in the spring.
I will say we do enjoy watching when they do the burns. All of a sudden I look out my back window and there's smoke, and it's kind of fun to watch what's going on back there. We have one more comment. Tyler Thompson says, "Hi Marcel, thanks for the talk. You mentioned that natives can grow most places. After you cut the sod, do you need to cover the ground with topsoil, or is the remaining earth able to sustain native plugs?"
That's a very good question. You know, when I did this in my front yard, I took off the sod and I thought, oh, maybe some black rich topsoil would be good to support the growth of the plants. And my plants grew big. They grew like 2 or 3 times the normal size that I see in some of the parks that are around Madison. And I think it's a complete waste of effort and money and time, because native plants don't need, you know, perfectly rich topsoil. They can pretty much grow in sand or gravel areas. Like now they come up in the driveway in cracks. There's not very little soil there, but they can cope with those conditions just fine. Plus, if you bring in soil, you have no idea where this soil is coming from. It could be full of seeds from weeds, and you'll have a big weed problem. So I recommend not amending the soil at all after we remove the sod. It's plenty good for the native plants. And you only have to water them for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, depending on when you plant them. The later in the growing season you plant them, the warmer it gets. And so you have to initially allow them to establish, but once they're established, you never water your native flowers. Like it could be 100 or more degrees. Some of the native flowers have roots 14 feet deep. It doesn't bother them if it's continuously over 100 degrees, and they will not wilt. They will continue to flower, whereas your lawn will be dead and ugly looking.
Okay, well, it looks like we're at the end of our hour. I really want to thank you very much. This was a wonderful talk. We're getting applause in the room if you don't hear that.
Well, thank you very much for
Yes,
inviting me.
and this will be, we have recorded, it'll be up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel in a few days. So you want to rewatch and see some of the links that he gave, it'll be there. Or if you want to share with your friends. Next week, our talk is Jean Sandrock. We'll talk about the process behind our most recent commissioned piece of art, a collage entitled Light of Life that was recently dedicated here at Midvale. She'll outline the inspiration, the materials, and the Midvale and biblical connections of this piece. Does anyone know where it is if you want to go look at it? Upstairs in near the Tokay entry. Is this piece if you want to go look for it. So we invite you back, including you, Marcel, if you're interested. The Zoom link is ongoing. So anytime you want to join us, feel free.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, we're also going to have a beekeeper hopefully talk sometime this spring too. So when we have those dates nailed down, we'll be in our newsletter. So anyway, thank you very much. Yep. Enjoy your day.
Have a good day. Thank you.